So this is the new NZXT H1 V2, and by the end of this video I want to see how much better it is versus the original NZXT H1, and also how it compares to some of the top ITX cases on the market, like the SUPT Meshlicious, NR200, and the new Dan A4 H2O. And understand, on the outside it doesn't look that different. It's a little bit bigger than the original, with the fitment of the panels a little bit better as well, but trust me, it's on the inside where there are some really meaningful upgrades. To start with, the riser cable has been updated to Gen 4 to support the newest GPUs and motherboards. There's now support for larger 3-slot graphics cards. The power supply has been upgraded to a 750 watt unit, and the diameter of the holes in the side panels have been increased to improve airflow. There's now also some active cooling in the GPU chamber thanks to a 92mm rear exhaust fan, as well as a separate fan controller for NZXT's CAM software. So with components getting hotter, more power hungry, and physically larger, these are all very welcome changes. The original NZXT H1 was a pretty good case when it launched, but along with a lot of ITX cases, it did eventually become a bit irrelevant when the new range of graphics cards launched from AMD and Nvidia. As a result, the new H1 is about 2 liters larger in volume than the old one, bringing it to 15.5 liters. So that actually makes it slightly larger than the SUPT Meshlicious, which is still one of the best ITX cases that you can buy at the moment, and that's a comparison that we'll definitely come back to. Now, a closer look at graphics card support here. Big 3-slot graphics cards up to 324mm in length now fit, so cards like the Asus ROG Strix and the MSI Gaming X Trio can now be installed, and the fitment is very satisfying. If, however, you do have a graphics card that is 3-slot and actually has 3 PCI expansion slots of thickness, then those cannot be installed. The EVGA 2080 Ti XC Ultra, for example, will not fit. There aren't many current gen cards out there that are like this, but still definitely worth double checking. To be honest though, a lot of the NZXT H1 is very familiar. The interior layout is divided the exact same way between components. It uses the same 140mm pre-installed liquid cooler, which is surprisingly effective, and all of the cables from the power supply are pre-routed and ready to be connected. The motherboard and GPU I/O is plugged in at the bottom, and your front I/O is still right at the top, although now we do have an additional Type A USB port. And that leads us to another very familiar thing about the NZXT H1, and that is just how easy this thing is to build in. Firstly, you install the mounting hardware for your CPU cooler onto the motherboard, which is pretty easy. Then you open up the case and install it. Probably the trickiest part is plugging in all of those tiny cables, but thankfully they are all pre-routed and managed for you, and after that you can install your CPU cooler. Then lastly, flipping the case around, we just need to install the GPU and plug it in, and that is the entire build completely done. The end result, in about 5 minutes, an extremely clean looking ITX system with about as minimal effort as possible. The price is a bit expensive at $400 US, and you are forced to buy it as a kit, but realistically, as we've spoken about before with the NZXT H1, if you were to buy the case and price up the components of the power supply and the AIO by themselves, you probably would be left with about the same price. So in my opinion, the quality of the components that you're getting here, plus, it's already pre-installed for you, that totally justifies the price in my opinion. So the finished build looks pretty nice, and it was about as easy as building a PC can get, but the real question is, how does it perform? After all of these updates have been focused on improving performance. So here is the original NZXT H1. With the GPU fans locked at 2000 RPM, it gets seriously warm without any assisted airflow like case fans. Naturally, the GPU fans would ramp up by themselves, and they would improve the result to about here. This, on the other hand, is the new H1, sitting right towards the middle of the stack and giving us basically the same GPU thermals as the SUPT Meshlicious and the Dan A4 H2O. This was with the rear exhaust fan running at 1300 RPM and the CPU fan, which is exhaust by default, at 1100 RPM. If we flip the CPU fan to function as intake, that is intaking the air into the case, that dramatically worsens the temps for the GPU, so best to just leave that fan as is. It does mean that your CPU temps will be a little warmer while gaming, since some of that heat from the GPU is passing through the CPU's radiator, but it's not as big of a difference as you might think, and running the GPU as cool as possible is definitely the priority here. As for what you can expect for CPU temps under full load, the i5-12600K is what I installed for this build, and that had absolutely no problem running at full tilt in Cinebench. This was also with the fan speed at just 1300 RPM, which was reasonably quiet. Now, taking a look at at our previous test data, the original H1 put up very reasonable CPU temps for just running a 140mm AIO. It could run our overclocked 10900K with stable performance. So about a 12600K is about as far as I'd recommend going for the H1 V2 before you need to start modifying the voltage and power for the CPU. But realistically, 12700K and 12900K can be done here if you do some power and voltage tuning. So I mean, yeah, at least in terms of performance, I think we can agree this is pretty impressive. To bring it up to performance which is kind of, at the sub to Meshlicious and the DNA4 H2O, that is not bad at all. And I understand it is bigger than both of those cases, but for keeping the same layout, only making the case 2 liters larger than the old one, I feel like NZXT have done a pretty good job here. Overall, GPU thermals are 13 degrees better than the previous model. So making a closer comparison versus the sub to Meshlicious, the GPU thermals are basically the same between these two cases, with the CPU thermals being less capable on the new H1. The Meshlicious can realistically run up to a 12900K, granted your motherboard isn't feeding it too much voltage. So if your build needs that much CPU performance and power, then you might want to go down that route instead. If you don't plan on throwing in an i7 or an i9 though, and you were thinking more i5 12400, 12600K, and you don't mind a slightly bigger case, then I actually do think the H1 is a viable alternative to the Meshlicious. It is significantly easier to build in, it does look a little bit cleaner on the exterior as well, but that is a subjective point, and GPU performance is about the same. Now, if you are more of an ITX enthusiast, the new DNA4 H2O is probably the better choice if you do actually want something really small. Basically, it takes the similar thermal performance of this case and packages it into an 11 liter volume. Then of course we do have the NR200P Max, which we can't forget. It is still the ultimate performance-focused ITX case. It has the best combined CPU and GPU performance that I've tested, and it's also super easy to build in like the new NZXT H1, just a bit big for what some people want for an ITX case. So again, can definitely recommend. We'll leave it linked down below for those interested. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.